The cold night of July 16, 1918, settled over Ekaterinburg like a dark shroud, wrapping the city in a silence that felt like an ominous prelude to something far worse. The streets, once bustling with life and grandeur, were now eerily still, as if even the earth itself had begun to hold its breath. Inside the Ipatiev House, the once proud home of Russia's royal family, an air of helplessness hung heavy. What had been a palace of imperial splendor now felt more like a tomb. The walls, cold and unforgiving, echoed with the absence of the wealth, power, and influence that had once defined the lives of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. In this darkened room, the sound of breath and the rustling of clothes were the only things that punctuated the stillness. Tsar Nicholas, once the sovereign ruler of the vast Russian Empire, now sat with his family in the shadow of a cruel and unavoidable fate. The man who had once commanded armies and presided over an empire that stretched across continents was now a prisoner, stripped of his title, his power, and his identity. There were no grand palaces to escape to now, only the cold stone walls of this house, the prison that would mark the end of the Romanov dynasty. The very empire he had inherited and failed to defend had turned its back on him, leaving him vulnerable, broken, and at the mercy of those who had once bowed before him. Across the room, Alexandra, his wife, sat quietly beside their children. The tension in the room was palpable, each family member holding on to what little dignity they had left. The emperor's once proud children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the young Alexei, sat in silence, their faces pale, eyes downcast. There was no noise save for the occasional cough or the rustle of fabric, as one of the children shifted uncomfortably. The uncertainty of their fate hung in the air, heavier than the cold that seeped through the walls. Outside, the winds howled across the vast expanse of the Russian countryside, a reminder of the revolution that had uprooted the empire they had once ruled. The Bolsheviks had taken everything: the throne, the riches, the empire, and now they were about to take the last thing that remained: their lives. It had all happened so quickly. One moment they were the rulers of an empire, and the next they were captives in their own home, waiting for the inevitable. There was no escape. The walls of the Ipatiev House had become their prison, their final resting place. Nicholas stared ahead, his once regal face now weathered with the burden of loss. The weight of his failures, the crushing defeats in war, the bloodshed of revolution, the abdication, pressed on him. His every thought was consumed by the realization that his reign had ended in catastrophe. What had begun as a dream of peace and prosperity for his people had unraveled in violence and bloodshed, leaving nothing but ruins behind. And now, in the dim light of this forsaken house, he was powerless. His empire was gone. His people had turned against him. The revolutionaries had stripped him of everything, and now they would take his life. The silence was broken only by the faint murmur of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Nicholas knew what it meant. The revolutionaries were closing in. They had come for him before, taken him and his family from their palace, imprisoned them in this house, and now they were coming for the final act. The door creaked open, and a soldier entered, his face impassive. He said nothing, simply motioning for the family to stand. Their fate was already sealed. In the darkened room, the family rose together, their movements slow and deliberate. There was no panic, no pleading for mercy. The realization had settled in. They would face their deaths together, as they had once ruled together. Nicholas took one last look at his family, his heart heavy with sorrow and guilt. His wife, his children. He had failed them all, and yet, even in these final moments, he held himself with a quiet dignity. His head was held high, his eyes steady as he led his family out of the room. The corridor outside was cold, and the air smelled of damp stone. As they were escorted down the hallway, the sounds of their footsteps seemed deafening, echoing off the walls. The guards flanked them on either side, but their movements were stiff, their faces impassive. Some of them had once served the royal family, and yet now they were the ones who would bring about their end. The air was thick with the tension of their presence, the tension of an entire nation's future hanging in the balance. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement doors loomed ahead. There was no turning back now. The family stepped into the dark, the space suffocating and cold. In the dim light, they saw the awaiting executioners, soldiers with grim faces who had come to do their duty. Nicholas stood still, his eyes moving across the room to his children. Their faces, filled with fear, but also with a stoic resolve, met his gaze. The door to the basement closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the air. The royal family stood in silence as the sound of footsteps faded into the distance. The world outside, the revolution, the empire, they were all gone now. All that remained was this moment, the last Romanovs standing together, their fates sealed in the cold shadows of history. In the darkness there was nothing left to say. No words of defiance, no pleas for mercy, only the cold weight of fate. And in the silence, the echoes of revolution rang louder than ever as the final chapter of the Romanov dynasty drew to a close. The Ipatiev House loomed ominously in the dim light of the Ekaterinburg night. The once proud symbol of the Romanov family's exile had become a dark, suffocating prison. The stone walls, thick and cold, absorbed every whisper that dared escape within its confines. This was no longer the home of an imperial family. It was a tomb, a place where history would draw its final cruel line beneath a dynasty. Inside the house, the royal family huddled together in the basement, the space far too small for those who had once ruled a vast empire. The cold seeped through the walls, gnawing at their skin, the silence oppressive. The oil lamps flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows across the room. The royal family, once surrounded by grandeur and luxury, now sat in a darkened room with only a few feet between them and the inevitable. The fear that had been building for days hung thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. But in those final moments they retained a quiet dignity, one that would not fade even in the face of death. Nicholas II, the once mighty Tsar of Russia, sat with his family, his face a mixture of sorrow and calm. The weight of his failures, the war, the revolution, his abdication, pressed down on him, but in the depths of his eyes, there was still something that had not been extinguished, a deep, unyielding love for his family. Alexandra, his wife, sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. Her face was pale, her eyes betraying the fear she could not hide, yet she held herself with the same quiet resolve. They were all aware of what was about to happen, and yet they did not flinch. Around them, their children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the fragile Alexei, sat in stunned silence. The girls, though terrified, did not cry. They had known pain and suffering for months, forced to endure the indignity of captivity, the loss of everything they once knew. But they had each other, and that, for them, was enough. Alexei, their youngest, barely 15, held his mother's hand. The hemophilia that had plagued his short life made him even more fragile, a delicate soul in the face of the overwhelming brutality that was coming for them all. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of Ekaterinburg, a relentless reminder of the revolution that had turned the world upside down. The streets that once bustled with pride for the monarchy were now silent, abandoned. The empire that Nicholas had once ruled was no more. The Bolshevik forces had crushed it, their grip tightening around the Romanovs with every passing hour. The once mighty Tsar, who had commanded the loyalty of millions, now found himself bound by chains of fate. His power, his authority, reduced to nothing more than the trembling silence of a family facing death. The royal family had been through days of confinement, their every move watched, their every word carefully scrutinized. They knew their time had come. They could feel the weight of history pressing down upon them, the whispers of revolutionists filling the air. Yet, Despite the terror that gnawed at their hearts, they faced it together. The dignity that had been instilled in them from birth never wavered, even as they prepared to meet their end. In the corner of the basement stood a group of Bolshevik soldiers, their faces etched with uncertainty and fear. They were the ones who had been ordered to carry out the execution, but not one of them looked comfortable in their role. They had been tasked with the impossible, ending the life of a monarch, a figurehead of a dynasty that had once ruled Russia for over 300 years. They had come for the royal family, but what they would leave behind would be a scar upon the conscience of the nation for generations to come. Some soldiers fidgeted nervously, glancing between their comrades, their faces pale with anxiety. They had been given orders, but orders did not erase the humanity they had once shared with the people they were about to kill. Among them stood Yakov Yurovsky, the man who had been assigned to lead the execution. His face, stern and emotionless, belied the tension that swirled in his chest. He had long since accepted the Bolshevik cause, but even he could not escape the moral weight of what he was about to do. He had witnessed revolutions, seen leaders toppled, and empires crumbled, but this moment felt different. Killing a king, a czar, and his family was not a simple execution. It was the eradication of an entire way of life. Outside the walls, the wind howled louder, carrying the distant sounds of a revolution that had already begun to transform Russia. The Bolsheviks were securing their power, crushing the old guard with ruthless efficiency. The royal family's death would mark the final chapter of the Romanov dynasty, an ending so brutal, so final, that it would ripple through history. The family would be lost, their legacy drowned beneath the waves of change, yet their deaths would inspire the Bolsheviks to continue their grip on power, their revolution solidified by the cold blood of a once mighty empire. As the royal family sat in the basement, their thoughts were far from the soldiers, the guns, the executioners. They were together, as they had always been. Their final moments were filled with memories, the moments of joy, of love, of shared grief. But now, in this cold, dimly lit room, those moments had been stolen from them. Their time was up. The execution was near. The Romanovs had once held the world in their hands, and now the world was closing in on them with the cruel certainty of revolution. A final shudder passed through the room, and the doors to the basement creaked open. The cold light of the oil lamps flickered, casting long, haunting shadows on the walls. The royal family stood, a unified front of defiance, and walked forward into the awaiting darkness. The soldiers, their hands shaking, stepped aside. Their mission had begun, and with it, the final chapter of the Romanovs' reign would be written in blood. The end was now inevitable. The roar of revolution had silenced the empire. Now it would silence the royal family forever. And in the shadows of that basement, with the smell of death thick in the air, the fate of the Romanovs was sealed. The night was dark, and the air in Ekaterinburg felt heavy with an oppressive stillness. The cold winds swept through the streets, biting at the exposed faces of the soldiers who had gathered outside the Ipatiev House, preparing for the task that would forever alter Russia's history. Inside, in the small, dimly lit basement, the royal family sat huddled together in the shadows, their faces pale, but their composure firm. The silence was thick, the tension palpable as the inevitable loomed closer with each passing moment. Nicholas II, once the most powerful ruler in Russia, sat quietly with his wife, Alexandra, their hands intertwined, their children seated around them. There was no panic, no desperate cries for mercy. They had known for days that this moment would come, and they had accepted their fate. The revolutionaries had stripped them of everything, their title, their wealth, their empire. But they could not take their dignity, not yet at least. The soldiers outside prepared for the moment they had been ordered to carry out. They whispered to each other, their voices barely audible in the cold night air, some shifting uncomfortably, others standing firm. This was not just a political execution. This was the end of a dynasty, the extinction of a centuries-old royal family. For some, It was a task they had accepted. For others, it was an unbearable burden. But the command had been given, and there was no turning back now. The door to the basement creaked open, and the heavy footsteps of the guards echoed down the hallway. It was time. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children rose from their seats, their movements slow, deliberate. Their eyes met one last time, a silent exchange of love and acceptance. They had always been a family, and now, in their final moments, they would face the end together. The Bolshevik soldiers filed into the room, their eyes cold and determined, the dim glow of the oil lamps casting long shadows on the walls. Nicholas, who had once been the embodiment of imperial authority, now stood before these men as a prisoner. His face was tired, but there was no fear in his eyes. He had failed his country, his people, and most tragically, his family. But in that moment, there was only resignation. The man who had ruled an empire now stood before those who would bring his reign to an end. Alexandra, his wife, stood beside him, her face ashen but resolute. She too had faced the collapse of her world, watching helplessly as their family and the empire they had once ruled were torn apart. But she, like her husband, was unbowed. Her hands shook slightly as she clasped her children's hands, but her composure remained unwavering. She had long since resigned herself to this fate, but her heart ached for the children, who had once danced in the halls of the Winter Palace, now standing at the edge of death. The soldiers lined up in front of them, their faces grim, the weapons they carried raised in their hands. The tension in the room thickened, and the silence became unbearable. In the shadows, the royal family stood together, their backs to the wall, a last desperate attempt to retain some dignity in the face of death. There was no time for final words, no grand speeches. There was only the cold reality of the moment, a single irreversible act that would reshape Russia forever. The commander, Yakov Yurovsky, stepped forward, his face set in stone, his eyes cold and impassive. He had been given orders, and in his mind there was no room for hesitation. He nodded to the soldiers, and with a single command, the room fell into chaos. The family was positioned against the wall, their bodies trembling with the knowledge of what was about to happen. But there were no cries, no pleas. There was only the sound of the soldiers' footsteps and the heavy silence that filled the room. The final moments unfolded in slow motion, each second drawing them closer to their tragic end. The children, their faces filled with fear, clung to their mother and father. Nicholas looked down at his son, Alexei, his heart breaking for the boy who had never known a life of peace, who had been born into a world of turmoil and suffering. Alexandra, her face pale but dignified, whispered soft words of comfort to the children, trying to shield them from the horror that was unfolding before them. And then, with the deafening sound of gunfire, the world fell into chaos. The room erupted into movement as the soldiers carried out the execution. The once mighty Romanovs, reduced to prisoners in their own house, met their end in a cold, dark basement that would forever bear the mark of their fall. The finality of it all struck hard. There was no celebration, no triumph in the air, just the hollow echoes of history that would never be the same. The royal family, who had once been untouchable, now lay lifeless, their blood staining the floor beneath them. The monarchy, centuries old and revered, had been extinguished in an instant. As the soldiers stepped back, their task complete, the room was silent. The echoes of the gunfire faded, leaving only the haunting reality of what had just occurred. The revolution had claimed its final victory, and the family that had once ruled Russia was no more. The night outside was still, the cold wind still howling through the streets of Ekaterinburg, but within the Ipatiev House, there was only the oppressive silence of death. The world had changed forever, and with it, the history of a nation. In the basement of that house, in that final, irreversible moment, Russia's monarchy met its tragic end, and the echoes of that night would reverberate for generations to come. The cold walls of the Ipatiev House seemed to press in on the royal family as they gathered together in the dimly lit basement, each member of the family facing the inevitable with a profound sense of calm. The chaos of the outside world had long faded from their minds. What remained was the quiet, unshakable bond between them and the grim realization that the moment of their execution was near. Tsar Nicholas II, once the powerful ruler of a vast empire, now stood in the heart of his personal collapse, his empire shattered beyond repair. But in these final moments, he was not a monarch clinging to power. He was a father, a husband, and a man of faith. His thoughts, despite the surrounding darkness, remained with his family and his country. He looked around at his children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, and felt a deep sorrow, but not fear. They were his blood, his flesh, and they would face this together. Alexandra, his beloved wife, stood beside him, her face pale but composed. She too had accepted their fate. Her eyes, once filled with the fire of a queen, now held the quiet strength of a woman who had long ago surrendered herself to the inevitability of this moment. She clasped his hand with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Their children stood beside them, their fear tempered by the courage of their parents. The youngest, Alexei, had been so fragile throughout his life, burdened by illness, yet in this moment, he clung to his mother and father with a sense of calm that belied his youth. As the family stood huddled together, there was no shouting, no tears, no frantic calls for mercy. They had long accepted their fate. They were not the rulers of an empire now. They were a family united in their final moments, the last vestiges of the Romanov dynasty. The emotional toll of the revolution, the imprisonment, and the endless uncertainty had already taken its toll. But in this moment, they found strength in each other. It was not a last act of defiance, but one of quiet dignity. They would not face this end as victims. They would face it as one. Nicholas's thoughts turned inward, to the country he had once ruled, to the millions who had depended on him, and the empire that had crumbled under his watch. He knew deep down that he had failed them all. His reluctance to adapt, his refusal to embrace the changes that were happening around him, had led them all to this fate. Yet, as he stood there, surrounded by his family, the shame of his failures melted away, leaving only the will to face his death with dignity. His legacy, whatever it might have been, was no longer in his hands. It was now the responsibility of the next generation, the children he had sworn to protect. "God save Russia," Nicholas whispered, his voice barely audible. The words were not just a prayer. They were the last expression of his hopes for the country he had failed to lead into a new age. They were a final plea for redemption, not for himself, but for the nation he had left behind. His lips trembled slightly, but his face remained composed. There were no grand final speeches, no cries of defiance, only the quiet resolve of a man who had come to terms with the collapse of everything he had once known. Alexandra, standing beside him, took a deep breath. She too had found peace in these final moments. Her life, once filled with the splendor of court life, had been reduced to this. She had watched as her husband's empire had disintegrated, and now she watched as he prepared for the inevitable. In these final minutes, there was no room for regret, only acceptance. She glanced at their children, her heart breaking for their loss. But there was no escaping it. They too had accepted the moment. There would be no more running. The revolution had come for them all, and they would face it together, as a family. Tatiana, the eldest daughter, stood close by, her face pale but unwavering. She had always been the most composed of the children, the one who had kept the others calm during their darkest days. In this moment, she clung to her mother's side, her eyes fixed on her father, who stood as a pillar of strength in the face of death. Maria and Anastasia, younger but equally brave, stood with their heads held high. They had not known a life free of turmoil, and yet they had learned to find comfort in each other's presence. And Alexei, the youngest, whose health had always been fragile, clung to his parents with an almost unnatural calm. There were no screams or tears, just a quiet acceptance. It was as though, in the face of death, they had found the strength to be unyielding. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence, and the guards moved into position. It was time. The family knew what awaited them, but they did not flinch. There was no more fear. What remained was only the quiet strength of family, of people who had been through too much together to break now. Their eyes met one last time. No words were spoken, but none were needed. In that brief, fleeting moment, they all understood. Nicholas stood with them for a few more seconds, feeling the weight of his past and the finality of the moment. His heart was heavy with grief for his family, but there was no bitterness in his soul. His failure was a part of him, but it would not define him in his final moments. As the cold metal of the soldiers' rifles appeared before them, Nicholas stood tall, his back straight. The executioners, their faces hard and unreadable, took their places. "God save Russia," Nicholas whispered once more, his voice breaking slightly. His words were a prayer for the future, a future that would be written not by him, but by those who would carry the weight of his mistakes. In the stillness, the final moment arrived. The royal family faced their fate together. There was no fight, no resistance. Only the calm acceptance of a family that had lived through decades of turmoil and now, together, would die with dignity. Their story had come to an end, but their legacy, the quiet grace with which they met their end, would remain. In the cold basement of the Ipatiev House, a new chapter of Russian history began. One written not by the monarchy they had once ruled, but by the revolution that had claimed their lives. As the cold, dissonant silence enveloped the Ipatiev House, the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family felt like a death rattle for the Russian monarchy. Yet the world outside was slow to comprehend the full weight of its significance. The soldiers who had been given the grim task of ending the lives of the royal family stood in a rigid line, their faces masked in a mixture of discomfort and duty. There was no victory in their actions, no sense of triumph. The violence they had just enacted, cold and brutal, was carried out with chilling efficiency. These men had been ordered to carry out an execution, nothing more, nothing less. They had no illusions about the magnitude of what they had done. It was a task, an unpleasant duty that had to be done to eliminate what they considered a symbol of oppression. But as the gunshots echoed through the basement, the moment of finality fell over the room, and the soldiers couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had been lost in those final seconds. The shots rang out, swift, ruthless, final. But what followed was a thick, unbroken silence, an unnatural stillness that seemed to suffocate the air around them. It was as if time itself had stopped, and the world had collectively held its breath. No cheers erupted from the crowd. No cries of victory rang out from the revolutionaries who had long desired the death of the monarchy. The silence was a reflection of something far more profound, an unsettling realization that Russia's past had been irrevocably erased in one brutal stroke. The soldiers stood, their eyes downcast, their hands trembling slightly as the echoes of the shots faded into the cold stone of the basement. There was no joy, no satisfaction in their mission, only the uncomfortable weight of the task they had been given. The revolution had demanded blood, and blood had been spilled. But this was not the righteous victory many had hoped for. Instead, it was the sobering realization of what had been lost in the process. The monarchy was dead, and with it, a way of life that had endured for centuries. But even more troubling, no one was sure what would come next. The soldiers, standing in the shadow of what they had just done, couldn't help but wonder if they had truly freed the Russian people, or if they had simply plunged their country into a darker, more uncertain future. Outside, the storm raged on, its winds howling like the voices of the past, caught between the weight of a fallen empire and the dawning of a new age. The streets of Ekaterinburg were still, the air thick with the uncertainty of the times. No one was celebrating. No one felt like they had won. The death of the Romanovs had been inevitable, but it had come at an immense cost, one that would only be fully understood with time. In the months and years that followed, the historical consequences of the Romanovs' execution became clearer. The fall of Russia's imperial dynasty marked a definitive break with the past, a break that would set the stage for the rise of the Bolsheviks. Lenin, emboldened by the events surrounding the execution, quickly seized upon the vacuum of power left by the monarchy's collapse. The execution of Tsar Nicholas II did not bring peace to Russia. It ignited further unrest and resentment, as factions within the country grappled for control. The echoes of the royal family's brutal end reverberated across the land, providing the final catalyst for the Bolshevik Revolution. The blood spilled that night did not settle the chaos in Russia. It stirred it. The death of the Tsar and his family became both a rallying cry and a symbol for those who sought to establish a new world order, one where the elite were overthrown and a new vision of Russia would be born. In the eyes of the Bolsheviks, the execution represented a moment of cleansing, a symbolic erasure of the old regime. For them, this was the beginning of a new Russia, one that would rise from the ashes of imperial oppression. But the cost of that revolution was staggering. The death of the Romanovs was not simply the end of a family. It was the erasure of an entire way of life. The monarchy, once the very heart of Russia's power, was gone. The people who had once revered the Tsar were now faced with the reality of a rapidly changing world, a world where their once glorious past was nothing more than a faint memory. The ghosts of the Romanovs haunted the halls of history, their deaths forever altering the Russian landscape. For the Bolsheviks, the death of Nicholas II and his family was not a moment to be celebrated, but one to be feared. Lenin's rise to power and the creation of the Soviet Union would be shaped by the blood spilled in Ekaterinburg. Yet, the revolutionary movement that he helped lead was far from an uncontested victory. The murder of the Romanovs would forever mark a turning point in Russian history, one that would have far-reaching consequences. The overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a communist regime came at a tremendous human cost, one that would not be fully understood for generations.